Hey everyone, this is Dr. Jacobs. Welcome to Chapter 2, Where to Start. During this unit, there are a few things that I want you to be able to do by the time we get to the end of it. First, I want you to be able to describe the different sources of ideas for research that are outlined in this chapter. I want you to be able to create a research question with formal research and null hypotheses that can be tested with inferential statistics. I want you to be able to explain the two functions of a theory. I want you to be able to compare and contrast different types of journal articles. I want you to be able to identify the major parts of an empirical research article. I want you to find and read a current systematic review or meta-analysis on your specific topic for the course. I want you to be able to summarize what is commonly included in the major sections of an empirical research article: the abstract, the introduction, the method, results, and discussion sections. I want you to be able to create and use an efficient search strategy for academic databases. And I want you to be able to request articles successfully from the interlibrary loan. I also want you to be able to demonstrate an ability to conduct searches of past research using academic databases. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So conducting research. When we conduct research, the first thing that we typically want to do is start reading research on the particular topic. Each research area actually has its own culture associated with it. And so, for example, with suicide prevention research, there's certain terminology that we use or don't use when discussing fatal and non-fatal suicide attempts. So for example, you'll notice that I didn't say a word that many of you hear probably within popular culture related to suicide deaths. And it's equivalent of the worst curse word you could ever use within my field. And I'm just going to say here so you know it and you're aware of this, but in suicide prevention research, we never say committed suicide. It used to be that making a suicide attempt was considered a crime and people could be jailed or hospitalized for this. And so when they did that, commit suicide meant that they were committing a crime. And so suicide prevention researchers, if you use that within suicide research, then they won't take you seriously and you'll never be published. But you wouldn't know that unless you've done the reading within the field to know that we don't use that, because what that type of language does is stigmatize mental illness and seeking treatment. And so we try to refrain from using that kind of language. Just like also within suicide prevention research, we don't use the words successful or unsuccessful attempt, because most of us would say that you're actually successful if you survive a suicide attempt. So typically researchers will use fatal or non-fatal suicide attempts. And so these are just some examples of some of the vernacular that people will use within a particular research field. And so the only way that you can learn some of these rules, some of the language and the different culture associated with it, is to actually read research on the specific topic. You also have to be able to develop a testable research question. Hopefully these research questions were introduced to you in your statistics course. That was a prerequisite for this class, but we will go over it a little bit as well in here. Something else that should have been covered in your prerequisite stats class was writing research and null hypotheses that align with that research question. If you don't remember, I know that if you had statistics with me, we did this where we worked through research questions and research and null hypotheses. If you don't remember or your teacher didn't go over that, please make use of my office hours. That will be the best time. And yes, I know that sometimes you can't come in person, but we can also set up a Google Meet or Zoom or something like that to talk through some of these things. You got to design the research study. There's more to it than just making a testable research question and writing the research and null hypotheses that align with it. There's a lot of considerations that we have to take into account when we're designing research studies. So are we going to use between groups, within groups, match group design? Those are some terms that should be familiar from statistics class. Are we going to have a very specific population? Are we going to study UCM students? Are we going to study athletes at Warrensburg High School? We're also got to design like what kind of measures. So if you remember from statistics, measures are these tools that we use to turn information into numbers. So if we are studying depression, you might use the Beck Depression Inventory to be able to turn someone's severity of depression into a number so that we could use that. And so there's all these little pieces that we have to take into account when conducting research. You also have to get institutional review board approval, IRB approval. We have a chapter that we'll go over with this. You'll also be completing the city RCR for social and behavioral sciences training to be able to conduct research in this class. You have to collect your data after you get that IRB approval. You have to run the statistical analyses that you learned in your stats class. So I know my statistics courses, we actually did almost all of the statistical analyses by hand. When we get to the point to analyze data in this class, we'll have to learn how to use software to analyze it. Then you're going to write up your results from those analyses. And so this is kind of just the general. In here, we're learning to conduct quantitative empirical research, which is why we had statistics as a prereq for this class. But in order to do that, we actually have a little bit of a different type of hypothesis testing steps than what I taught in my stats class. So let's talk about this a little bit. And this is mostly because we're not going to be doing the math by hand. We'll be using handy dandy software for this. So there'll be a little bit of a revision in this process if you had stats with me. All right, so the hypothesis testing steps are the steps that we use so that we can try to answer a research question using a quantitative data set. Okay, so this often starts by developing a research question. The way that they describe the research question within the book is not necessarily how I'm going to define it for our class or how we will craft our research questions. We'll have a very specific method for doing that in here. Determine which statistical analysis you want to use to answer the research question. You're going to write your research and null hypotheses in symbols and words. You're going to run the statistical analysis. You're going to make a decision about the null hypothesis, remembering that there's only two decisions that can be made with statistics. Either we're going to reject the null hypothesis or we're going to retain the null hypothesis. Then we'll conduct any relevant follow-up analyses, and then we're going to write up our results. So if you took statistics with me, you notice here that step 4, run the statistical analyses. We used to look up a critical value number within a table that I provided the class, and then we compare our test statistic to that critical value so that we can make a decision about our null hypothesis. In this class, we're actually going to collect data, and then we're going to run those analyses in software and use that to make a decision about our null hypothesis. The reason why in my stats class we do it by hand in that very introductory course is so that we really learn what those different statistical analyses are doing. All right, so research question and hypotheses. We use these hypotheses testing steps to try to answer a research question using our quantitative data set. And a research question, then, this is the definition that I want you all to use for this class, is a testable question we're asking as a researcher that is answered or supported by the research or null hypothesis. Okay, so a hypothesis just then is a statement that can be supported or unsupported by testing it with quantitative data. So we have two different types of hypotheses that we will craft for our research questions for our project. A research hypothesis indicates that there is a significant difference, relationship, or prediction, while a null hypothesis indicates there is not a significant difference, relationship, or prediction. So if you remember from your statistics class, when we're running statistical analyses, what we're often trying to do is see if we're testing differences between groups, we want to see if there's a big enough difference that that difference didn't just happen because of chance. There's a lot of reasons for that. There's the fact that we're using a sample instead of looking at the entire population, which was sampling error. The measures that we use to turn information into numbers is another source of error, which would be called measurement error. And then we also know that anytime that we conduct some sort of research study, that there's going to be some random error that goes into our scores. So with statistics and research, when we're doing this, we want to see if there is a difference between groups, if that's what we're doing, that it's big enough that doesn't happen by chance. Or if we're doing some sort of correlation where we're looking at a relationship, that our correlation is significantly different from 0, because we know if we have a correlation of 0, that means there's no relationship between our variables. And then if we're doing linear regression or some form of prediction, we want to see if our predictor variable significantly predicts our outcome variable. So when we're dealing with our research hypothesis, we're always looking for these significant differences, that these differences or relationships or predictions are not just because we have chance. The null hypothesis then is always going to cover everything that our research hypothesis doesn't cover. And this is where we indicate there's not a significant difference, or there's not a significant relationship, or not a significant prediction. Okay. So the way that we write these formal hypotheses, though, depend on our research question and the statistical analysis that we're using to analyze our data set. Okay, so there's a very specific way that we do this depending on which analysis that we're using. And this is some information that should have been covered in your prereq stats class. So if you don't remember or you're struggling with that, then you're going to want to make sure that you're coming in, that you're using my office hours, that you're really going through all the materials that I'm providing for this class, because we're going to be using everything that we learned in our prereq stats class. All right, so some of those analyses that you should have learned include the one sample z-test, the independent samples t-test, the dependent samples t-test, the ANOVA, that's also called analysis variance, the Pearson product moment correlation, and these last couple you may or may not have covered in your class, depending on how much time your instructor had or your professor. And that's linear regression and then chi-square statistic for goodness of fit. So these are typically the ones that are covered in a prereq stats class. And these ones will be what your options are for your project. All right, so research question, the reading defined research question slightly different than what we do in class. We already went over that definition, but I also wanted to give you all an example of a research question. So here's one. Research question: is there a significant difference in the amount of sleep participants get if they have or have not been formally diagnosed with a mood disorder? So here we find that we have two groups that we're comparing, right? People who have been diagnosed formally with a mood disorder and those who have not. And we're trying to see, is there a significant difference in the amount of sleep each of these participants are getting? And so when we did this, if we were doing this in real life, we would use what kind of statistical analysis to analyze this data? So you got to think back to your prereq stats class. What statistical analysis would we use to analyze this? This would be an independent samples t-test, okay? So with our hypotheses then, when we have a research hypothesis, we're looking at a significant difference, again, relationship or prediction. Our null hypothesis, there's no significant difference, relationship or prediction. And when we're writing these hypotheses, right, so we'll have our research question, we'll have our research hypothesis, and our null hypothesis. One of those two is going to be what we think is the answer to that research question. And so when we write these hypotheses, we can write them directionally or non-directionally. So when we write our hypotheses directionally, that just means that we believe, if we're looking at significant differences, for example, that one group will have a significantly more something than the other group, or it could be we think that one group will be significantly less than in our dependent variable of the other group. So for example, if we're looking at examining the effectiveness of antidepressants, we might get a sample of participants. We might randomly assign participants to be in the group that gets the antidepressants. Then we might randomly assign the other participants to get the sugar pill or the placebo. And when we do that, we would compare them to see if there's significant differences in the level of depression that they experience. And if I was the pharmaceutical company, I would think that my group that is getting this antidepressant would be significantly less depressed than the group that's getting the placebo. Now, if they weren't, then that means that that pill doesn't work, right? And so when we write our hypotheses, that's an example of writing it directionally. We think that the group getting the antidepressants will be significantly less depressed than the other group. When we write them non-directionally, though, if we're looking for significant differences, we would be just comparing, and we think there might be a significant difference, but we don't know which group will be higher or lower than the other. And that would be writing our hypotheses non-directionally. So whenever we're writing hypotheses, however, we want to write them directionally when we can, because that does something that's called increasing the power of our test. When we increase the power of our test, all that means is that we are more likely to reject our null hypothesis, which is what we want, if our null hypothesis is not true in the overall population. So remember, when we're doing inferential statistics, which are that one sample z-test, independent samples t-test, dependent samples t-test, ANOVA, Pearson product moment correlation, linear regression, chi-square statistic, what we're doing is we're taking a sample to make guesses about a larger overall population. When we're using statistics, we always have that sample, right? And so just because we find results with our sample doesn't actually mean that reflects what's going on in the overall population, okay? And so when we're designing our studies, we want the power of our test to be high enough that if our null hypothesis is not true in the population, we want to reject the null hypothesis with our sample. Okay. And so what that means is that we find significant results or significant differences. And that's important for a few reasons. One, the goal of science is to look for the truth, right? And then after finding results, to publish in the scientific literature. There is a bias within the scientific literature to only publish what they consider significant results. Okay. And that just means that we rejected our null hypothesis. Okay, so the materials also said there were several places that we could get our ideas to conduct our research studies. For this class, we're going to only use one of these areas. I mean, it might be informed by some of these other ones, but some of these things are better than others. One said common sense, practical problems. They threw suicide prevention research under practical problems, observations from the world around us. For example, like if you've taken lifespan development, Piaget actually wrote his research from observing his children, which I think is really interesting. So people do some of these things. Theories to test and refine theories. And the major one, the one that we'll likely be using most in here, is past research. So even with practical problems like suicide prevention, a lot of the ideas for that comes from past research that's in those particular areas. And so some people would say that in order to conduct research, you have to be familiar with the research area by doing these literature reviews and immersing yourself into the scientific literature. Or because if you don't, then it's unethical, because there's several design issues that have been refined over decades and decades of research. You find out what's already been done, what subtle problems there are, and it's really important to do this. And the more that you read the past research, when you're reading these articles, you can be like, well, they've done this, and this, but they haven't done this yet. I could add to the scientific literature in this way. Sometimes students are like, no, it's all been done. There's nothing I can add to this research area, because our studies should be adding something new, right? And that's not true. There's always room for growth. There's always something new that we can study. And the way that we kind of start learning, okay, what's already been done, what hasn't been done? Like, why didn't they do this? Or they could have done this subtly different, or they could have used a different population to study. So theories then, a theory is a systematic body of ideas about a particular topic or phenomenon. Theories go and organize and explain a variety of specific facts or descriptions of behavior. They also generate new knowledge by focusing our thinking so that we notice new aspects of behavior. And they come from actual data from prior research, as well as numerous hypotheses that are consistent with the theory. So sometimes people are like, oh, I have a theory. And they use that word to say idea, right? I have a theory. I heard someone yesterday actually say, I have a theory about people with neck tattoos. And that's actually not a theory, that's an idea. Unless they've collected data on it and there's several studies that support it, it's not actually a theory, it's just an idea. And so when we're within our field, or when we're within research, we will use theory to look at basically like a framework that helps organize specific facts or descriptions that helps us generate new knowledge. Okay. So past research, again, for this class, we will read past research to develop research questions to test. To do this, we'll learn to search academic databases and read research effectively. Okay, so there's several different types of journal articles that have been presented in this unit. One type was literature reviews, and they basically said this just provides summaries of previous research on a particular topic. You're probably most familiar with doing literature reviews for papers and stuff. So if you've read primary source peer-reviewed journal articles, but in the past you read them and you summarize them and you put them into a paper, that is a literature review. They try to describe the differences between a systematic literature review and a regular literature review, but I don't believe they did a really great job at doing that. So literature reviews, you're just on a topic, right? And you just find it and you look for articles and you write. A systematic literature review, however, researchers systematically search all of the research literature given specific parameters. So it could be specific dates. I'm going to review all the literature from March 2017 to March 2020. Okay, specific dates. A lot of times there will be a specific databases that they choose. So some of the ones that were presented in the reading, I believe Psych Info was one of the ones, right? So it could be like, I'm going to search Psych Info from this date to this date. I'm going to use these specific search terms. So I'm going to be looking for, let's say, depression in adolescence and learning. Okay, let's look at learning and depression in adolescence. Okay, so there's very specific things that you're looking for. With systematic literature reviews, you actually have inclusionary and exclusionary criteria. So we're only going to include these particular things, these particular studies. So they have to include adolescence, they have to include learning, they have to include depression, and then we might have some exclusionary criteria as well. So we could say, well, we want people who have typical development. So we're going to exclude people with intellectual disabilities or developmental disabilities from this literature review because we're looking at a very specific, or on the flip side, maybe that's exactly who they want to study is depression with people with developmental disabilities and learning in schools. Okay, so systematic literature reviews it's a very specific process, and there's actually guidelines that people have to follow, and you can publish your guidelines for the systematic review that you want to do to websites like Prospero, so that other researchers know what you're doing. So right now, we're working on a literature review and meta-analysis. Sometimes you'll see these terms together, and we published our record, and a scientist has sent me an email asking, hey, what are you specifically doing? Because we want to make sure ours are not overlapping. Okay, so there's a very big difference between just a regular literature review and a systematic literature review. And there is a difference between a systematic literature review and a meta-analysis, even though a lot of times you find them together. So with a systematic literature review, there's no numbers. You're not analyzing any of the results from those studies. You're just finding common themes and trying to get an answer, but you're using more qualitative data and you're just writing words. A lot of times people will do a systematic literature review and a meta-analysis and put them together in an article. And when we do that, we systematically search the literature. And then what we do is we take the results from each of those studies, and then we analyze them together to see if we can get a bigger picture about what's going on this one specific topic. So whenever we do a research study, the material said that we don't say that it proves our hypothesis correct if we have significant results. What it does is either it supports or does not support our hypothesis. So because we do that, we know there is error anytime that we're doing something. So just because we find results in one single study doesn't mean that's the actual thing. There's always a chance of a type 1 or a type 2 error whenever we get our results. So meta-analysis tries to control for that by looking at all the literature and seeing what the common themes are. And so when we're doing this for our topics for our class, the very first thing I want you to find this week is I want you to be able to find a systematic literature review or a meta-analysis or a meta-analysis on the specific topic that you're wanting to examine. Okay, because even if you just have a systematic review, you won't be able to use that as a primary source for your project. But what it will do is it'll give you a whole list of articles that you can look at. And if you're reading along in their literature review and you're like, oh, that sounds like a really good article, you highlight it, you go to the references page, you highlight it, and then you go back to our library webpage, see if we have the article here. And if we don't have that article, you go to the interlibrary loan and request the article ASAP. Sometimes it takes them a little bit to find articles. They're really, really good, actually. And almost anything I've ever needed came really quickly, but you'll want to do it now because that article may not come out the way that you want either. Sometimes people cite articles wrong as finding things that they didn't find. So you need to give yourself time and wiggle room to be able to read those things. Meta-analyses are a little bit different, and you can actually use these as primary sources because what they do is they analyze the data of other researchers. So if that fits into what you're wanting to do, you could do that as well. It also mentioned about theory articles. This is where they summarize and integrate research to write a new framework for understanding a phenomenon. And then empirical articles, like we're going to be writing for this class, is a study in which data were gathered to help answer a research question. So there's different parts of an empirical article. There's a cover page. For this class, we'll be using the professional cover page. There's an abstract, which is basically a summary of the specific things that you did in the study. So this is more like, what's your research question? What are your hypotheses? What's some information about the method of how you conducted your study? Like how many participants do you have? What's their age range? What were your results? And usually these are under 250 words. Then we have the introduction part of our paper, where it has its own parts as well. We'll learn more about this as we do some more of the readings for this class. But in an introduction, typically what we'll find is people will introduce their topic and why it's important. After that, researchers will move into the literature review portion of the introduction, where they review the studies that have been done in the past. After that, then we the next part of the introduction is describing what hasn't been done yet, what are the limitations of the current research literature in the articles that you read, what hasn't been done yet. And when we write that, we're gearing that toward the study that you're actually going to conduct. So we use that as the rationale for why we're going to do our study. And then the last paragraph of the introduction describes our current study, which houses our formal research hypotheses and a research question and things like that. After we're done with the introduction is the method. The method breaks down often into different components. You're going to learn more specifically about what APA requires for each of these sections in a manuscript. It has the journal article reporting standards, or JARS, and it has a checklist of everything that you need. So for the method, typically there's a participant section that describes the people that participated in our study. There's a measure section that describes the tools that you use to quantify your information. So if we did the Beck depression inventory, we describe that and its reliability and validity information. And like if it's a Likert scale, the scale anchors it could be 1 from not at all to 7 all the time. Okay, so whatever the scale anchors are for it. And then we'll have a procedure section. Typically that is the recipe or the step-by-step guidelines that allow other scientists to replicate your study. We also have our results, and when we have our results, that includes writing our results in statistics in actual numerical form, which hopefully you remember from your stats class. We will have a little bit of review on that. And then your discussion section, often what it does is kind of summarize your results in a way that people understand. Also, how do your results fit into the current research literature? What's the importance of your results? Sometimes it'll include what limitations you had in your study, and then what future research studies that you could do in that very specific research line. It's not something that's brand new. It's saying if you follow this type of research, what else could you do in the future? And then you'll have your references. So when we're searching the literature, you have to find quality research studies to read. We have our own dedicated librarian here, so you're going to want to consult our course site for details on that. You also want to make sure that the articles are directly related to the specific topic you're researching. And I'm saying this here and people don't listen when I say this, because sometimes it'll be like, oh, I'm doing a topic on depression. Well, that's too broad, right? There's so many specific narrow areas. So for example, I'm a suicide prevention researcher. One of the areas that I really like to examine are the suicide warning signs. So I specifically look in trying to determine if the suicide warning signs actually work. Okay, that's a very specific area that has thousands of articles on it. And so when we're doing this, if I was writing a paper on the suicide warning signs, I'm not going to want to look at suicide prevention in schools or looking at reattempts after emergency department, or I guess they could call, emergency department admissions for non-fatal suicide attempts. I'm not going to look at those things. What I'm probably more going to look at is what research has already been specifically done on determining if the suicide warning signs work or not. So students really struggle with that, and they'll look for any article and they'll just have it so broad that when they go back to write the paper later, they have to go and read more articles because it's all over the place and it's not narrow enough where they can go in and write a paper. Okay. Often, and this is why I'm going to have you do this week, often starting with a systematic literature review or meta-analysis is the best place to start. This does a couple of things. One, it allows you to become familiar with what's current. So you're going to want this to be within the last 5 years. It allows you to get a little bit of a historical context to the things. Sometimes it'll define some jargon. It'll also help you find a whole bunch of different references that you can request. When we're looking for articles, we don't just want to go in the databases, print off the first 10 articles in there and read those for our paper. What we want to do is find specific articles that match the topic that we're wanting to do. And systematic literature review and meta-analysis papers are a great place to start. And the projects that we're doing in here, if you are wanting to go to the Great Plains Psychological Convention, which is a student convention that typically happens in the spring semester, each semester, these might be good things that you could take to that, right, and get experience. So if you're wanting to go on into grad school or something like that, something that sets people apart is their ability to conduct research and present at different conferences and things, and it's a really fun experience. Traditionally, our students have done really well at it and have won a lot of awards going to this conference. So if that's something you're interested in, take this project. I mean, everyone should take this project really seriously, but you could actually use this to put something that's on your curriculum vitae that will set you ahead and apart. So again, for our project for this class, you have to read journal articles that are peer-reviewed, empirical, which means quantitative research. So if it's a qualitative study and there's no statistical analysis, you cannot use it. It has to be primary source. This is something that students struggle with quite a bit. In fact, sometimes students don't realize that they're committing academic dishonesty. So when we're reading an article, when we cite that an article has done something, we're talking about specifically what those researchers did in their study. So this would be that last paragraph of the introduction where they describe their current study, the method section where they describe what they did and the materials they used and the procedures and participants, and the results section where they have actual statistical analyses that they found. So sometimes what students will do is they'll go and they'll read the introduction of the paper and specifically the literature review portion where the authors cite a different study. And then sometimes students will erroneously go in and say that this study did something that they cited as another study doing. So that would be a secondary source. And we don't use secondary sources because it's a lot like, and I'll bring this metaphor up again, it's like playing the game telephone. So I don't know if y'all played that when you were little. It's where you get a whole bunch of people, you sit in a circle, someone whispers something in someone's ear, and they only get one chance, and that person whispers what they thought they heard to the next one, and it goes all the way around. And what happens by the time it gets to the last person, when they say out loud what they thought they heard, it's never exactly like it was when the first person said it. And that's exactly why we don't use secondary sources. Even really smart people make this mistake a lot. Even students make this mistake a lot, and you'll actually start getting really kind of pissed off about this now that I've told you this, now that I've opened your eyes to this. If you haven't had your eyes open to this before, you'll be reading an article, you're like, oh, I'm going to highlight this, I want to read this article that found whatever results because this is what they said they found, and then you go in and you'll see that they made that mistake and they actually did not cite what that other article did. They use a secondary source. And I actually used to have an example of this that I used for class where one article that I wrote was used not properly by one of the counseling associations by another state here in the Midwest. And they said that parents said something, and I didn't talk to a single parent in my study. We examined principals of secondary schools. And so it was really interesting to see that, because that was definitely not a result of our study, which means this big professional organization for counseling in a state in which I will not name wasn't doing ethical work, because that's considered academic dishonesty. It has to be quality. It needs to be current, so typically less than 5 years old, unless you clear it with me first. There may be some situations where you want to cite an article that is a theoretical article that is the very first one, the seminal one, the one that gave birth to the whole field. Typically, we're not going to do that in here. Typically, your articles need to be less than 5 years old. And they have to be full articles. You can't just read the abstract. If you read the abstract only and you cite that, there's actually a specific way to cite that within APA style. And for this class, you need to read the full articles, because the more full articles that you read, it does a couple things. One, it helps you to become more literate in reading scientific literature. Two, it also has a lot more context. And it helps you to understand what's going on with the field, because you'll read the literature review, you'll start getting ideas. Also, three, of articles that you should read. And when you read more and more articles within a particular research field, you'll start to see there's some articles that are cited across different studies quite frequently. If you start seeing that happen, that probably means you need to read that article. So searching databases, so the materials talk about Boolean operators, and these are just simple words such as capital and or capital or not and not, used as conjunctions to combine or exclude keywords in a search, resulting in a more focused and productive results. Okay, so this helps you narrow search to a specific topic. It helps eliminate articles that you don't need to search through, so it can help you save you some time. We have some materials in our folder to teach you how to use these a little bit more, and our book went over them as well. So that is our lecture for this week.